Welcome to this episode of Hot Off the Printing Press, a review of current events in money and banking from a free banking perspective. This podcast is produced by Justin Merrill of freebanking.org.
Today is January 29th, 2013, and I am Justin Merrill. In today's episode, we have a market snapshot, an interview with Ben Bernanke, a segment on Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, the Bank of Japan and political independence, and finally, the blog roll. In today's market snapshot, gold is at $1,662 an ounce. The S&P 500 is at $1,506. The other two times the S&P 500 has rallied above $1,500, it has collapsed below $800. West Texas Intermediates trading at $97.49 a barrel. 10-year Treasury note has risen to 2%. It has been below 2% since April 2012. Treasury yields reached a low of 1.43% in July 2012. The federal funds rate remains at 25 basis points. The yen is trading at 90 yen per dollar, and it'll cost you $1.35 to buy a euro. Today we are very privileged to have a special guest.
Hi, I'm Ben Bernanke, Chairman of the Federal Reserve System.
Chairman Bernanke, when you gave a lecture series on the Federal Reserve to college students at George Washington University, you explained how you believed in following Walter Bagehot's advice. Can you explain what he said the central bank should do to operate as the lender of last resort without encouraging moral hazard?
The lender of last resort function, the notion that in a financial panic, a central bank can follow Bagehot's rule of lending freely against good collateral at a penalty rate, and that by providing short-term credit to financial institutions, a central bank can offset the effects of a run or a panic and the accompanying damage to the financial system and the economy.
Chairman Bernanke, could you explain to our listeners what qualifies as good collateral?
Complex and opaque financial instruments that proved fragile under stress, particularly subprime mortgages with adjustable interest rates, and GSE debt and mortgage-backed securities.
Right. Thanks for making that clear. Now, could you explain what qualifies as a penalty rate of interest?
25 basis points. A basis point is 1/100th of 1%, so 25 basis points means 1/4 of 1%.
0.25% is a penalty rate of interest? Okay, I think I'm beginning to understand. Do you actually believe in Bagehot's advice, or were you just paying him lip service and misleading the poor students?
That's a very good question. I don't know.
Abe, the BOJ, and political independence. The Liberal Democrat Party, LDP for short, has controlled the Japanese national government almost consecutively since their founding in 1955. The Minority Party, the Democratic Party of Japan, or DPJ for short, took control briefly in 2007 when a series of political scandals and the economy made the ruling LDP unpopular. Alas, the DPJ didn't live up to their promises, and the relatively conservative LDP regained power in December 2012. The new Prime Minister is Shinzo Abe, who first served as Prime Minister before the DPJ took power in 2007. The Japanese economy, by some measures, has been sluggish since around 1990, following an asset bubble collapse. Japan's lost decade, going on 2.3 decades, has since been the playground for pet economic theories. Monetarists, including Milton Friedman when he was still alive, argued the low nominal interest rates in Japan were a signal of tight money, and the Bank of Japan had the power to heal its economy with an expansion of its balance sheet above the level of reserves required by the banking sector. This policy is now commonly known as quantitative easing, and most central banks seem to be experimenting with different forms of it these days. The Keynesians argued that the zero interest rates in Japan were a signal of a liquidity trap, and that the only way out was fiscal policy to restore demand as the private sector restored their balance sheets. Japan tried an all-of-the-above approach, both tripling the BOJ's balance sheet as a share of GDP and using fiscal deficits to finance infrastructure spending. Japan's public debt to GDP now exceeds 235%, the highest in the world, but continues to have incredibly low borrowing costs despite multiple downgrades. Japan tried to print and pave their way to prosperity without any clear results. The challenge of economics is it is impossible to hold variables constant and know the counterfactual. Did the policies prolong the recovery, or did they prevent the islands from sinking into the Pacific? Japan was hit with a double whammy. Both the global financial crisis and the tsunami that led to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear incident in March 2011. As a result of the incident, Japan decided to phase out their use of nuclear energy, which left them dependent on importing fossil fuels and domestic rationing of energy. Japan's export-driven economy began to suffer as the yen appreciated against the dollar and the cost of producer inputs rose, thus squeezing margins and cutting back on production. Japan's perpetual trade surpluses have turned into deficits lately, and the country just recorded their largest deficit since 1980, after the peak of the second oil shock. This go-around, Prime Minister Abe is determined to reinflate the Japanese economy. Koichi Hamada, a Yale University economics professor and advisor to Prime Minister Abe, has called for a 2% CPI inflation target for the BOJ, as well as additional fiscal stimulus and infrastructure repair. Professor Hamada would like to see the yen trading near parity with the dollar, or roughly 100 yen per US dollar. He is calling for institutional changes to the political governance of the BOJ, which he blames for being too tight with monetary policy due to an unwarranted fear of hyperinflation. While it is quite common for economists to criticize the central bank's policy, it is rare for an economist to call for a reduction of political independence for a central bank. Economists tend to prefer that technocrats, rather than short-sighted politicians, direct monetary policy, since loose monetary policy can have short-term gains and long-term costs. Perhaps the most jaw-dropping statement from Professor Hamada is, "There is nothing wrong in buying all the government debt as long as it doesn't ignite inflationary expectations and actual inflation." In the past 70 years, Japan has never gone into hyperinflation, end quote. This is the type of logically fallacious statement that is historically a good indicator for taking the contrarian trade. I seem to recall a certain Ben Bernanke proclaiming in 2006 that we've never had a decline in housing prices on a nationwide basis. All swans I've seen are white, therefore they all must be white, right? But Masaki Shirakawa, the governor of the Bank of Japan, isn't afraid of hyperinflation. He's afraid of asset bubbles. You see, Japan's financial asset bubbles formed in a period of low and stable CPI inflation in the 1980s. Shirakawa is concerned that by targeting a higher inflation target, new asset bubbles could form, or the nominal interest rates will rise with inflation expectations, which could depress asset prices and reduce economic growth. Rising interest rates could also spark a public finance crisis, as a large outstanding debt may become a burden to finance at higher rates. Shirakawa and his BOJ peers are also concerned about the BOJ's ability to hit a higher target, since relatively aggressive policy has been unable to create inflation in Japan thus far. Despite their dislike for Abe's policy reform, the BOJ buckled under pressure and agreed to raise the inflation target from 1% to 2%. Why would the BOJ suspend its political independence? Well, to retain its political independence. It agreed to cooperate in a compromise that excluded legal revisions to the mission and governance of the central bank. Part of the agreement, however, includes subjecting the BOJ to the oversight of a political committee called the Council on Economic and Fiscal Policies. On January 22, 2013, the Bank of Japan and the Japanese government co-released a document outlining the new growth policy targets, and the BOJ released another document outlining the actions the BOJ will undertake to reach those targets. Both releases are included in the links provided. The three pillars of Abenomics are aggressive monetary policy, fiscal stimulus, and structural reforms to the economy such as deregulation, raising the retirement age, promoting free trade by joining the TPP, and lowering the corporate income tax. Japan's aging demographics and hefty social safety net may be making the country uncompetitive. But will voters approve reform? The retirement age may need to increase as Japanese tend to live long and healthy lives. Japanese baby boomers are getting older, and the ratio of workers to dependents is decreasing. Due to these demographic and cultural reasons, it is common for children to remain single and care for their aging parents into adulthood. Japanese are prolonging marriage into later years as well. The low net birth rate demographics should scream for pro-immigration reform, but Japan's homogeneity, cultural heritage, and geographic isolation result in nationalism. They often are irrationally wary of foreigners. The aging population has resulted in a shortage of nurses and geriatricians, but it required a free trade agreement between the Philippines and Japan just to provisionally allow 500 much-needed Filipino nurses to care for the aging on a limited and restricted basis, provided they could pass language proficiency and professional equivalency exams. These work visas also would not provide a path to immigration to Japan. Another example is a policy response to the global financial crisis. As manufacturing orders declined in the recession, factories such as Toyota began cutting back on hours, initiated job sharing, and laying people off. The Japanese government's response to the cutback in blue-collar jobs was to offer immigrants and descendants of foreigners, mostly of Brazilian descent, a one-way ticket home, provided they never returned to Japan to look for a job. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP for short, is a multilateral free trade agreement that will liberalize trade. The biggest problem politically is Japan's politically entrenched farmers that rely on protectionism to remain viable. Japan and the United States have the highest corporate tax rates, and both would benefit from lowering their rates in order to regain competitiveness. Corporate taxes discourage investment and employment, as the taxes increase the discount rate the firms use to gauge the profitability of potential projects. Corporate taxes sound good to the populous man in the street, but the burden of taxes is shared between employees, consumers, and shareholders. So what will the Bank of Japan do to hit their target of 2% inflation? According to their press release, they will initiate an open-ended asset purchase program that will purchase 10 trillion yen in US T-bills and about 3 trillion yen in Japanese government bonds per month, for a total of 13 trillion yen per month as needed. The asset purchase program won't start until January 2014, a year from now, even though Abe has a sense of urgency, and the joint release stated, under the price stability target specified above, the bank will pursue monetary easing and aim to achieve this target at the earliest possible time. Taking into consideration that it will take considerable time before the effects of monetary policy permeate the economy, the bank will ascertain whether there is any significant risk to the sustainability of economic growth, including from the accumulation of financial imbalances. Since the program won't go into effect for a year, how has the market reacted? Well, first off, the yen has declined substantially against the dollar since the elections in mid-November, a 13% decline, from 80 yen to 90 yen per dollar. Prime Minister Abe's jawboning has scared the foreign exchange and capital markets into believing that he just might be crazy enough to pull it off. The Nikkei has also rallied 26% since mid-November. On the day of the announcement, January 23rd, the yen depreciated less than 2 yen against the dollar, signaling that the market had already discounted most of the policy into the exchange rate. In fact, the details of the asset purchase program have underwhelmed. The Nikkei dropped more than 2% the day of the announcement. The reason is not only the delayed implementation, but the fact that the 13 trillion yen of new asset purchases barely offsets the maturing securities currently held on the balance sheet. The Bank of Japan estimates that the net increase in the monetary base will only be 10 trillion yen for the entire year of 2014. The net increase of less than 1 trillion yen per month is slower than the current rate of money printing of 3 trillion yen per month. The current program will expire at the end of this year as the new program begins. The current purchase program's assets will be held until maturity and not be reinvested after the program ends. At the World Economic Forum this week in Davos, Switzerland, Abenomics had its share of critics and a few supporters. Christine Lagarde, director of the IMF, gave support for the monetary policy but urged Japan to get its fiscal house in order. The Bank of Korea criticized the Bank of Japan for manipulating exchange rates, even though it has only done so through communication thus far. Bank of Korea governor claimed that the BOJ moved too fast and that rapid changes in exchange rates are destabilizing. An anonymous representative of the ECB worried that Japan was pursuing a beggar thy neighbor monetary policy that could fuel further currency wars. In order to stave off critics who chastised Prime Minister Abe for eroding central bank independence, he gave a video message at Davos stating, "The Bank of Japan will implement policy measures independently. My belief in maintaining the central bank's independence remains firm and has not been shaken at all," he said. Prime Minister Abe may have given the BOJ an offer they couldn't refuse, but Governor Shirakawa's term ends this April. Prime Minister Abe will be able to appoint his own new head of the BOJ that will take his marching orders anyways. Resistance to the political pressures would have been costly and futile. Japan continues to be a playground for pet economic theories, and we should pay attention. Their experience is a path that the United States may be following in a post-asset bubble economy. The newly proposed asset purchase program may be ineffective, but the 2% inflation target is explicitly a target rather than a goal that they care to differentiate between the two in their press release. If they fall short of their target, they will adopt more aggressive programs than the one that is currently laid out. Also, it may be possible that the BOJ governor that replaces Shirakawa could revamp the current plan if he thinks that the current one is too conservative and unlikely to hit their inflation target. In recognition of the late James Buchanan, this drama has been a marvelous example of public choice. Politicians, bureaucrats, special interests such as exporting car manufacturers, and the electorate have all interacted in a way that conforms to their incentive structures. No matter what policy you think the central bank should be pursuing, the politicization of monetary policy should be viewed as a troubling trend. Free banking, the separation of money and state, is the only way to ensure that money is depoliticized. In today's blog roll, I'd like to call to attention two books. One of them is Boom and Bust Banking. It's a series of chapters on monetary policy over the last decade. It's edited by David Beckworth and published by the Independent Institute. This was my Christmas present to myself, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading it over the holidays. Two of the authors are our own guys, George Selgin and Larry White, and the authors tend to come from either a free banking perspective or a nominal GDP targeting perspective. The other book I would like to bring to your attention is a book I haven't read yet, but it's a newly released book called Market Monetarism, Roadmap to Economic Prosperity by Marcus Nunes and Benjamin Mark Cole.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe to freebanking.org on YouTube and iTunes, where you can share, like, and comment on our episodes. You can also follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. Our website is freebanking.org, the center of free market money and banking. If you'd like to contact the producer of the show to provide feedback or arrange possible interviews, please email him at justin@freebanking.org.